It was the coldest night of the year when he found her, barely 18, pregnant, and shivering alone by the roadside. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the door. What neither of them knew then was that one quiet act of kindness would change the course of 2 lives, and years later, she'd be the one holding his hand when the world tried to take him away. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of second chances, unexpected family, and the kind of love that rebuilds everything. If you believe in the quiet power of compassion, in stories where broken things are made whole again, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss a single chapter. Now, let's begin. The snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, coating the sleepy Vermont town in a thick, silencing blanket. Streetlights glowed like amber orbs through the haze, and the roads had thinned, one car at a time, as people hurried home to beat the storm. But Bo Callahan wasn't home yet. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield as the wipers slashed at the falling snow. His old Chevy truck groaned in protest as it climbed the final hill toward the wooded road leading home. The heater coughed lukewarm air, barely holding off the chill creeping in through worn seams. He was already late. Maisy would be waiting, probably pretending not to worry. Bo shifted in his seat, his lower back stiff from hours bent over the tiny gears of a grandfather clock someone had brought in for repair. He rubbed his hands together, fingers still smelling faintly of oil and cedar. Home was a few minutes away, a small wood cabin tucked into the trees. Quiet, familiar, predictable. He liked it that way, but that night would be the last ordinary night for a very long time. As the truck rounded a bend, the headlights swept over a dark shape on the shoulder of the road. At first, he thought it was a deer, maybe a bag of trash. Then it moved. Bo hit the brakes. The tires crunched to a stop just past the figure. He reversed a few feet, and the beams fell on something that twisted his gut with an old, aching instinct. A girl, no, a young woman, sat hunched in the snow, arms wrapped around her knees, coat too thin, face hidden behind a curtain of dark hair matted with flakes. And she was pregnant. He saw it clearly now. Her belly was full and round beneath a threadbare sweatshirt that couldn't possibly be warm. Bo opened the door and stepped into the snow, the wind cut like a knife. "You all right?" he called. The girl flinched but didn't answer. He approached slowly, boots crunching with each step. Closer now, he could see the blue tinge around her lips, the tremble in her shoulders. Her face was young, too young, and her eyes, when she finally looked up, were a storm of pain, pride, and something close to defeat. "I'm fine," she rasped, voice barely more than a whisper. "You're not," Bo replied, not unkindly. "You'll freeze out here." "I said I'm fine." There was no defiance in her tone, just exhaustion, as if she'd used up all her anger long before now. Bo hesitated. He didn't take strangers home. He didn't interfere. Not since Ellen died. Not since he'd had to learn how to be both mother and father to Maisy. He lived simply, kept his world small, safe. But some part of him, a part he thought had frozen along with everything else, moved. "Look," he said gently, "I have a cabin just down the road. It's warm, dry, you don't have to talk. You can leave whenever you want. But I can't drive off and pretend I didn't see you." The girl looked away, snowflakes catching on her lashes. A long silence stretched between them. Then she nodded, barely. Bo exhaled and helped her to her feet. She stumbled, and he steadied her. She was light, frighteningly so. Once inside the truck, she curled into herself again, silent except for the occasional shiver. "What's your name?" he asked as they drove. She didn't answer. "That's okay," he said, watching her from the corner of his eye. "You can tell me when you're ready." The cabin welcomed them with the crackle of firewood and the soft scent of cinnamon and pine. Maisy had fallen asleep on the couch, a book open on her chest and a flashlight dimming in her hand. Bo gently took the book and blanket, covered her, and turned to see the girl standing in the entryway, dripping snow in silence. He gestured to the kitchen. "There's soup on the stove. I'll get you a towel." Still wordless, she followed him. Her hands trembled as she held the bowl of soup, but she ate slowly, with a quiet urgency that made him feel suddenly old and helpless. "You can sleep upstairs," he said after she'd finished. "It's not fancy, but it's warm. Bathroom's down the hall." The girl looked at him finally. Her eyes had softened, though her mouth was still a tight line. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Enough. Bo nodded. "I'm Bo." She hesitated, then offered, "Lark." A bird in the snow, he thought. Fragile, out of place, but not broken, not yet. That night, after checking on Maisy and making sure Lark had what she needed, Bo stood alone by the fire, staring into the flames. He didn't know what he'd just brought into his home, into his life, but something told him this wasn't a detour. It was the beginning of a road he never knew he needed to take. Morning in the Callahan house came quietly, broken only by the hissing of the old kettle and the steady crackle of firewood in the hearth. Outside, the snow hadn't let up. It coated the trees, weighed down the porch rail, and silenced the world in a way only deep winter could. Inside, the warmth battled back the silence. Bo stood at the kitchen counter pouring 2 mugs of tea, one for himself, one for the girl still sleeping upstairs. Lark, the name had stayed with him all night, echoing softly in his thoughts like a wind chime in a forgotten attic. She hadn't said much, just a name, but the way she said it, flat but careful, told him everything he needed to know. She didn't give it easily, which meant she didn't trust easily, and trust was something hard-earned when you'd been left out in the cold, quite literally. Behind him, the sound of tiny footsteps. "Dad?" He turned to see Maisy standing in the doorway, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her curly hair a mess of sleep and static. She rubbed her eyes and looked up at him. "Who's that girl?" Bo knelt beside her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "She needed help. She's staying for a little while." Maisy blinked. "Is she nice?" "I think so. She's just tired." Maisy nodded in that way kids do when they absorb more than you want them to, more than you think they can. She didn't ask more questions, just walked over to the fire and sat cross-legged on the rug, arms folded into her blanket like a cocoon. A few minutes later, Lark appeared at the top of the stairs, moving slowly. She was wearing a sweater Bo had left folded outside the door, far too big for her, but warmer than the torn coat from the night before. She held the railing tightly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Her eyes scanned the room like someone used to being unwelcome. Bo saw it all, the practiced caution, the braced for rejection posture, the wall she built without realizing it. He offered her the mug of tea. She took it without a word. "This is my daughter, Maisy," he said gently. Maisy looked up, all eyes and softness. "Hi." Lark nodded. "Hi." Bo gestured to the table. "You hungry?" Lark hesitated. He watched the inner dialogue play out across her face, pride versus need. But finally, she nodded again and sat. Bo warmed up leftover biscuits and scrambled eggs while Maisy slid a drawing across the table. "This is you," she said. "And the baby." Lark stared at it. A stick figure with a round belly and a giant heart drawn in red crayon hovered over it. Her hand trembled slightly as she touched the paper. "Thanks," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. Maisy beamed. Later, after breakfast and dishes, Bo stepped outside to shovel the walk. Snow fell in lazy spirals now, thick and endless. As he worked, Tobias Knox from next door wandered over with his dog. "You got a visitor?" Tobias asked, voice low. Bo wiped sweat and snow from his brow. "Just someone who needed a warm place." Tobias tilted his head. "You sure about that? She's a kid, pregnant, scared. Still, you don't know her." Bo stopped shoveling. "You ever needed help, Toby?" The older man stared for a moment, then looked down at the snow. "Yeah, once, long time ago." Bo returned to his work without saying more. He didn't need Tobias's approval. What he needed was to follow what his gut told him, that this girl hadn't come into their lives by accident. That night, after Maisy went to bed and the house grew still, Bo found Lark sitting near the fire, clutching a worn spiral notebook. She didn't notice him at first. Her head was bowed, pen moving slowly, carefully across the page. Her free hand rested protectively over her belly. He didn't mean to startle her when he spoke, but the creak of the floorboard made her jump. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to sneak up." Lark sat up straighter, holding the notebook close. "Are you writing?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Letters. To her." She looked down at her belly. Bo took a seat across from her, careful not to make her feel cornered. "That's a beautiful thing to do." She shrugged. "It's dumb." "No, it's not. I want her to know something real, even if I mess everything up." "You won't. You don't know that. I know you're writing to her. That already makes you a better mother than some." The fire popped softly. Lark stared into it. "My mom said I ruined everything, that I brought shame. My dad couldn't even look at me. Said I was just like my sister, ran off with the wrong guy, got dumped, came back with nothing." Bo leaned forward. "You didn't come back with nothing." Lark turned to him, brows tight. "What do I have? You've got a heartbeat, you've got a name, and now you've got a warm place to rest. That's not nothing." Her eyes glossed with tears, but she blinked them away. She reached for the fire poker, nudging the log to spark new life. Bo stood slowly. "If you want to stay, it's okay, as long as you need." She nodded. Just once. And Bo knew, beneath the shame, the frostbite of rejection, the loss of everything she thought she had, Lark was still fighting to believe she mattered, and he was going to help her remember. The snow didn't stop. By the third day, Vermont looked like a painting. Trees dressed in white, rooftops buried under soft mounds, streets empty save for the occasional plow. It was beautiful, yes, but also isolating. Winter had a way of making time stretch long and silent. Inside the Callahan cabin, life had settled into a delicate rhythm. Lark was quiet, but not withdrawn. She rose early, often before Bo, and would already be halfway through a cup of tea by the time he stumbled into the kitchen. She helped with breakfast, played board games with Maisy, folded laundry without being asked. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was soft and steady, like someone learning how to belong without being a burden. Bo noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed how she ran her fingers across the wooden window frames like she was memorizing the texture of safety. He noticed how she lingered in the hallway after putting Maisy to bed, as if listening for a sound she hadn't heard in years. He noticed that she always sat by the fire, always with the notebook. And he noticed, perhaps most of all, that Lark never asked for anything, which made him want to offer more. Late one morning, the three of them were finishing breakfast when the power flickered and went out. The wind outside howled with sudden ferocity, slamming against the old house like it was trying to get in. "Storm must have knocked something down," Bo muttered. Maisy's eyes grew wide. "What about the heater?" "We've got firewood," he said. We'll be just fine." He stood and looked out the window. The snowdrift had nearly covered the bottom of the truck's tires. If they needed anything, they'd have to dig for it. Lark spoke up. "I can help." Bo turned to her. "With what?" "Firewood. I saw the shed when we pulled in that first night." Bo hesitated. "You shouldn't be lifting." "I'm pregnant, not helpless." There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet insistence. And Bo, to his own surprise, found himself smiling. "All right then," he said, "let's suit up." The wind cut through even their thickest coats as they trudged out to the woodshed behind the house. The snow reached Lark's knees, and Bo slowed his pace to match hers. He watched her closely, ready to stop her if she strained, but she moved with a kind of determination that didn't need pity. At the shed, he broke the silence. "You know, most people wouldn't be so quick to offer help." Lark glanced at him, cheeks red from the cold. "Most people don't want to feel useless." Bo nodded, understanding more than he let on. They worked in near silence, stacking logs into a large canvas carrier. Lark moved carefully but efficiently. She wasn't afraid of the work. She was afraid of doing nothing. When they returned to the cabin, Maisy had already lit more kindling in the hearth. The three of them sat together on the rug in front of the fire, sipping cocoa wrapped in wool blankets. "I made a snow angel once," Maisy said, looking at Lark. "Do you want to make one with me tomorrow?" Lark gave a small, genuine smile. "Maybe." Maisy grinned, satisfied. That afternoon, the first crack appeared in the wall. They were sitting by the fire, Lark with her notebook, Bo polishing a pocket watch, when she asked softly, "What happened to your wife?" Bo looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected the question, not yet. He set down the watch. "She passed 3 years ago, cancer." Lark nodded. "I'm sorry." Maisy was 7. She doesn't remember the worst of it, thank God. Silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, just heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Lark spoke again. "You kept going." "I had to. That's not the same as wanting to." Bo looked at her. She wasn't fishing for sympathy. She wasn't asking for his pain. She was just seeing it. He nodded. "You're right. For a while, I didn't want to. But Maisy, she saved me from disappearing." Lark swallowed hard. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly. "I don't know if I'll be any good at it." "You don't have to know. You just have to stay." That evening, the wind died down. The power returned with a soft hum, and the lights flickered back to life. Maisy cheered from the kitchen. But Bo didn't move. He watched Lark as she tucked the notebook back into the little wooden box near the hearth. He'd seen her writing more today. Pages, maybe. Whatever she was recording in those letters, it was growing. Maybe hope, maybe grief, maybe both. He remembered Ellen doing the same thing, writing notes to Maisy when she was too sick to speak. Little letters, folded and tucked into drawers. Words she didn't want to leave unsaid. He wondered if Lark knew what she was doing, planting something in that firelit corner of their home that would one day outlive the both of them. Later that night, after the house was quiet and only the fire remained, Bo stood in the doorway of the living room, watching the flames flicker over the wooden box. He didn't reach for it. Not yet. But he knew one day those letters would tell a story that began in the snow but didn't end there. A story of someone trying to matter, trying to stay, and maybe, just maybe, learning how to love again. The following days folded into each other like pages of a quiet, handwritten book. The snow outside remained deep, turning every errand into an effort. But inside the cabin, something began to thaw. Not the cold, but the silence. Lark spoke more now. Not in paragraphs, but in the occasional sentence that revealed fragments of who she used to be, who she might still become. Bo didn't push. He listened. He'd learned long ago that some people open slowly, like doors swollen with grief. Maisy seemed to sense it too. She asked fewer questions but offered more. Drawings, giggles, stories from school. She filled in the quiet the way only a child can, with a kind of light that didn't demand anything in return. And then there were the letters. One evening, as the wind patted gently at the windows and Maisy was upstairs getting ready for bed, Lark sat cross-legged on the rug by the fire. The notebook lay open in her lap. She was writing, her pen moving with slow purpose, pausing often as if choosing each word mattered. Bo sat across from her, a book in hand, though he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Finally, he asked what had been pressing on his mind for days. "Would you mind if I asked what you're writing?" Lark looked up. For a moment, he thought she might retreat again, but she didn't. She closed the notebook softly. "They're letters," she said. "To her, to my daughter." Bo set his book down. "Hope, right?" Lark nodded. "I wanted to call her something else before, something fancier, but after I ended up here, it just felt right." "It is," Bo said. "It's a good name." She smiled faintly, then looked down. "I started writing them when I was still at home. Before things got bad, before my parents found out. I thought maybe one day I'd give them to her when she was old enough. So she'd know the truth." "About what?" "About who I was before she existed. About what I was afraid of, what I loved, what I lost." Bo waited. He sensed more was coming, and it did, trembling but steady. "My mom told me I was selfish, that I'd ruined everything for them. College, the church reputation, the holidays. She said I'd break this baby like I broke myself, that I was disposable." Bo didn't move. The fire crackled. The shame in Lark's voice filled the room like a draft. "I didn't believe her, not at first, but after a while." She shrugged. "I started to wonder." Bo leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You are not disposable." Lark looked up, and something fragile flickered behind her eyes. "I write because if I don't, the fear takes over," she said. "If I can't give Hope a perfect life, at least I can give her the truth. And maybe that'll be enough." Bo nodded slowly. "You're giving her more than truth. You're giving her a mother who fights for her, even when nobody fought for you." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent, like the room knew something holy had just passed between them. The next morning, Lark surprised him. "I want to go outside," she said. Bo raised a brow. "You sure?" "I've been hiding for too long. I need to feel something real." So they bundled up, and Bo took her to the clearing behind the cabin, a gentle slope of snow-dusted meadow and trees bent low under the weight of winter. Maisy ran ahead, her laughter echoing like a songbird. "Let me show you how to make a snow angel," she shouted. Lark laughed, an honest, clear sound that startled even her. She lay down slowly, awkwardly, belly prominent, and moved her arms and legs in wide arcs. Maisy squealed with delight. Bo stood nearby, arms folded, watching something unfold that had nothing to do with snow. Lark sat up, breathless. "I haven't laughed like that in years." "Looked good on you," Bo said without thinking. She glanced at him, a flicker of something passing between them. Brief, uncertain, but not unwelcome. That night, after dinner and cocoa and a quiet story by the fire, Maisy went up to bed, leaving Bo and Lark once again in their now familiar ritual of evening silence. But tonight, Lark held out something to him. Her notebook. "You can read one," she said, "if you want." Bo took it carefully, like something sacred. He flipped through until he found a folded page, marked with a star. He opened it slowly and read aloud. Dear Hope, today I wanted to disappear. I sat on a park bench for hours, watching strangers walk by, and I wondered what it would feel like to be invisible. Then someone dropped a mitten. It was small, red and knitted and almost silly. I picked it up and handed it back to the woman. She smiled at me, said thank you, like I mattered. I held on to that smile all day. You'll have days like this, days when the world feels too big and too empty, but I hope you remember, even small kindness can anchor you. It did for me today. Love, Mom. When Bo looked up, Lark was watching him. Not guarded this time, open, scared, but open. You're not invisible, he said. I used to feel like I was. Not anymore. Lark swallowed hard. Thank you for seeing me. Bo nodded. Thank you for letting me. The fire flickered behind her, casting a soft golden light that seemed to hold the moment in place. In the quiet, something invisible but real passed between them. Not romance yet, not quite. But trust, the seed of it. And trust, as Bo knew all too well, was harder to grow than love. But it was the only soil anything lasting could take root in. Sunday morning arrived with a hush so complete, Bo wondered if the world had paused. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a sky so clear it looked painted. Sunlight spilled onto the snow in dazzling sheets, and every branch, every rooftop glittered with frost. Bo stood on the front porch with a steaming mug in hand. The air was crisp, sharp enough to sting his lungs, but he didn't mind. It was the kind of morning that asked nothing of you but presence. Inside, laughter stirred. Maisy's, followed by Lark's softer, slightly uncertain echo. He turned, walked inside, and found them in the kitchen. Maisy was dancing in thick socks on the wooden floor, spinning around as Lark held a wooden spoon like a microphone. She wasn't singing, just smiling, shoulders shaking with amusement. For a second, Bo stood unnoticed in the doorway, heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. The cabin, once a shell of quiet survival, now held something alive, and he wasn't ready for how much that moved him. After breakfast, Maisy dragged a cardboard box from the attic, the Christmas box. Worn ornaments, tangled lights, pine-scented candles, and construction paper stars spilled across the floor. "Can we put up the tree today?" she asked. Bo rubbed the back of his neck. "I haven't done that in a while." "Then it's time," Lark said gently. Bo looked at her surprised. "You want to?" "I think I need to." So they bundled up and trudged to the tree line behind the cabin. The air was filled with the crunch of boots and the occasional squeal from Maisy as snow slipped into her mittens. Lark moved slowly but purposefully, her coat now belted around her belly, her breath forming clouds. They found the tree together. A Douglas fir, modest but full, just wide enough to fill the corner of the living room. Bo cut it carefully as Maisy and Lark cheered. They hauled it home, laughing as the branches brushed snow over their heads like nature's confetti. Inside, they lit the fire and let the tree's scent fill the room. Ornaments went up one by one. Maisy hanging paper snowflakes, Lark tying ribbon bows, and Bo placing the star on top with a smile that didn't feel borrowed from memory this time. It was theirs now, not a replacement of the past, a reclaiming of the present. Later that night, they sat around the fireplace, the tree glowing behind them. Lark held a mug of cider, her hand cradling her belly absent-mindedly. Bo was on the armchair, Maisy curled beside him with a blanket over both their legs. Lark looked at the tree, then at Bo. "Do you ever wonder how grief makes room for anything else?" He considered her question before answering. "Every day. I used to feel like letting go of the sadness meant letting go of Ellen, Like moving forward meant I was erasing her. And now? He looked down at Maisy, who had drifted to sleep. Now I know grief isn't a wall, it's a doorway. Painful, yeah. But sometimes you have to walk through it to see what's still waiting on the other side. Lark nodded. I think I've been sitting in the hallway for a long time. Bo smiled softly. You're allowed to move at your own pace. She stared into the fire, eyes shimmering. You know, she said quietly, if someone had told me a month ago that I'd be trimming a Christmas tree with a stranger and his daughter, I'd have laughed in their face. Still might, Bo said, grinning. Lark chuckled. No, not tonight. Later, after tucking Maisy in, Bo returned downstairs and found Lark placing something in the wooden box beside the hearth. He paused. Another letter? She nodded. This one was different. Not just for Hope. For me, too. Bo tilted his head. You want to read it? She hesitated. Then, slowly, she opened the notebook and read aloud. Dear Hope, today, I laughed while decorating a tree. I don't remember the last time I laughed like that. Maybe I never have. There was a man with kind eyes, and a girl with a heart big enough to hold me, even though I didn't ask to be held. And for a few hours, I wasn't afraid. I hope you have days like this. Days when strangers feel like family, and the world seems soft around the edges. Days when you see how far you've come, even if you're still healing. Love, your messy, still learning mom. When she finished, the only sound was the fire popping gently behind her. Bo didn't speak right away. Instead, he crossed the room and sat beside her, not touching, just near enough for her to feel he was there. You're doing better than you think, he said. Lark looked at him, truly looked. So are you. The next morning, Bo found an old Polaroid camera in a drawer. Maisy begged to take a picture of the tree, of Lark, of their mismatched snow boots lined up by the door. They laughed, smiled, captured it all in a grainy photo that would one day feel like a miracle. A single moment when broken people found peace under falling snow and the light of a humble tree. For now, though, it was just a Sunday, a warm room, and three hearts slowly remembering how to feel whole again. The wind changed on Christmas Eve. Bo noticed it first. An edge to the air, colder than before, sharp as broken glass. The sky was heavy with low-hanging clouds, gray and untrusting, the kind of sky that held secrets. He'd lived long enough in Vermont to know a blizzard when he felt one coming. Maisy was too excited to notice. She was busy rearranging ornaments, humming a carol off-key, dragging a blanket across the living room like a cape. Lark had spent the afternoon on the couch, her hand resting lightly over her belly, her movements slower than usual. Bo watched her out of the corner of his eye, quietly alert. Something in her expression had changed. She smiled at Maisy's antics, laughed when Bo burned the sugar cookies, but her face was drawn, her hand twitching every so often. Back hurting? He asked casually, setting a tray down. Lark nodded, almost too quickly. It's fine, just normal stuff. But her voice was tight. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the mug of cider. Bo sat down beside her. When did it start? She looked away. This morning. He set his cup down, his voice low and steady. You should have said something. I didn't want to ruin today. Lark. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. Fear lived there now, real, raw fear. I'm not ready, she whispered. Bo's heart ached. No one ever is. By early evening, the storm had begun. Thick curtains of snow swallowed the landscape. The wind howled around the cabin like a wild thing, rattling window panes and stuffing the chimney with cold. Power lines flickered. The lights blinked twice before dying completely. The cabin fell into flickering shadows, firelight, candles, and quiet breath. Upstairs, Lark gripped the headboard of the guest bed, her face pale and tense. Bo had sent Maisy to her room with strict instructions to read with her flashlight and stay under the covers, promising updates and a surprise gift if she could be brave. Downstairs, he boiled towels and filled jugs with warm water. He had never delivered a baby before, never even been in the room. Ellen had passed before Maisy was born. The doctors, the machines, all of it behind hospital glass. Now it was just him and Lark and a baby who refused to wait. Lark cried out once, a low, guttural sound, and Bo climbed the stairs 2 at a time. He entered the room and found her doubled over, gripping the mattress, sweat beading along her hairline. "It's getting worse," she gasped. "They're closer now." Bo moved gently but without hesitation. "You're doing great. Let's get you lying down. We'll take it 1 breath at a time." "I can't do this," she choked. "Not here, not like this." "You're not alone," he said firmly, kneeling beside her. "You hear me? I'm right here. We'll do this together." Tears spilled down her cheeks. What if something goes wrong? Then we keep going, 1 minute, 1 breath, 1 push at a time. Her eyes locked on his, wide and terrified, but something in his tone grounded her. She nodded. Hours passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Pain, breath, silence, pain again. Lark gripped his hand through every wave, her fingers digging into his skin like she might fall if she let go. Bo spoke to her softly, his voice steady, calm. He wiped her brow, counted contractions, whispered encouragement when her strength wavered. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, another storm raged, but one full of life. Bo had never seen anything so human. And then it happened. A cry, sharp and small, splitting the air like a spark. Lark collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing, laughing, shaking all at once. In his arms, Bo held a baby girl, slick and red and howling. Hope. He wrapped her in a warm towel and handed her to Lark, whose face transformed in an instant. Exhaustion, awe, and pure love collided across her expression. "She's perfect," Lark whispered, cradling her. "She's strong," Bo added. They both stared at her. This tiny, fierce being who had waited for no one, who had chosen to arrive not in safety or order, but in chaos, in firelight, in the arms of people learning how to belong again. Later, as the storm softened into a muffled hush, Bo stood outside the door and looked back into the room. Lark was nursing Hope, her face glowing in candlelight. She glanced up, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. No words were needed. Bo descended the stairs, collapsed into his armchair by the fire, and let out a long breath. His hands were still trembling. His heart, too. On the mantel above the hearth sat the wooden box where Lark kept her letters. He hadn't read them since that night she offered one, but now he opened the lid and saw a new page tucked at the top, still damp with fresh ink. He picked it up and read, "Dear Hope, you came into this world in a storm, not in a hospital, not with doctors and monitors and bright lights. You came into firelight, into the arms of a man who wasn't your father but never left my side. You came screaming, and I came undone. But I held you, and I will never stop holding you. I don't know what comes next. I'm still scared, but I am no longer alone. You saved me tonight, little girl, and I promise I will be worth saving. Love." Mom Bo folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. He didn't know what tomorrow held, but tonight, in the warmth of a storm-battered cabin, new life had entered the world, and with it the faintest sound of something else stirring. Healing, perhaps. Or the first notes of love. January crept in quietly, brushing away the glitter of Christmas and leaving behind the hush of real life. The storm had passed. The snow still blanketed everything in sight, but it no longer felt ominous. It felt earned, like the calm after labor, like the silence that settles when something important has just happened. Hope was 3 weeks old, and she was changing everything. Bo noticed it first in the rhythms of the cabin, how time seemed to bend around her. Nights were shorter, days quieter. Lark had taken to rocking Hope in the armchair by the fire, humming low melodies that weren't quite lullabies. Sometimes Maisy joined in, her voice thin but sweet, holding her baby niece with the tender pride of a child entrusted with something holy. They had become a kind of family, not traditional, not simple, but real. Still, Bo remained cautious, not with them, but with himself. He had known what it felt like to lose something that felt like forever. He wasn't sure his heart could survive it again. Yet some days when Lark handed him Hope and their fingers brushed, when her eyes lingered just a second too long, he felt the slow turning of something undeniable, and it scared him, because it also felt good. One morning, while Lark and Hope napped upstairs and Maisy worked on a puzzle near the fire, Bo found himself in the narrow hallway beside the staircase. The small guest room, the one Lark had stayed in since arriving, had become a tangle of diaper bags, baby blankets, and half-folded laundry. The space was temporary, improvised. He opened the door to the spare room at the end of the hall, his old workshop. Dust coated the surfaces. The shelves were lined with broken clocks, abandoned blueprints, jars of screws and gears. The smell of oil and wood was still there, faint but familiar. Bo ran a hand over the workbench and stood there a long while, heart pulled in 2 directions. When Maisy peeked in and asked what he was doing, he smiled. "Thinking," he said, "about building something new." Over the next few days, he worked in secret, taking breaks while Lark slept, or Maisy distracted her with cocoa and baby stories. He cleared the space, sanded the windowsills, patched old walls, and replaced a cracked window pane. He salvaged a rocker from the basement, painted it pale yellow, and built shelves by hand. Rounded corners, soft wood, no nails sticking out. He crafted a cradle, too, no instruction manual, no power tools. Just memory, wood, and care. When he was done, he placed it near the window where the morning light poured in. He hung Maisy's old mobile from a rafter beam and stepped back, unsure if he had done enough, but knowing it had come from all he had left to give. That evening, after dinner and dishes and bedtime stories, Bo turned to Lark as she tucked Hope into her bassinet beside the couch. "I want to show you something," he said. She looked at him, surprised, then followed him upstairs. When he opened the door, she stopped in the threshold. The room was warm, softly lit, smelling faintly of lavender and pine. The walls were painted a muted sage green. A hand-stitched quilt, Maisy's first, lay folded over the edge of the cradle. For a moment, Lark didn't speak. Her hand rose to her chest. "You made this?" Bo nodded, suddenly unsure of himself. "It's not much, but I thought you two deserved more than a borrowed room." She stepped inside, brushing her fingers over the rocking chair, the bookshelf, the cradle. "This is more than a room," she said. "This is kindness made visible." Bo cleared his throat. "I didn't know if you'd want to stay longer, but if you do, it should feel like home." Lark turned to him, eyes glassy with tears. "This is the first place in my life that ever has." And before either of them could say anything more, Hope let out a soft cry from down the hall. Lark moved to go, but Bo gently touched her arm. "Let me." He returned a minute later with the baby cradled in his arms. The way he held her, secure, natural, reverent, made Lark's breath catch. He placed Hope into the new cradle, and she settled almost immediately. "I think she likes it," Larkin whispered. Bo smiled. "She has good taste." That night, Lark sat by the fire, notebook in her lap. Her pen moved slowly, as if each word carried more weight than the one before. When she finished, she tore out the page and walked over to the hearth, placing it gently into the wooden box. Bo was watching from the shadows, unnoticed. After she went upstairs, he waited until the room was still, then opened the lid and lifted the newest letter. "Dear Hope, tonight, a man who owed me nothing built you a room from nothing. Not just wood and paint and thread, but time, patience, kindness, the kind that stays. I watched him carry you like you were always his to protect, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Peace. Maybe home isn't where you come from. Maybe it's where someone makes room for you, even when they didn't plan to. Love, your grateful, tired, slowly healing mom." Bo read it twice, then carefully folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and stoked the fire. The baby had a room now, and maybe, just maybe, so did they all. The days began to lengthen. The snow, once thick and suffocating, softened into slush along the driveway and sparkled like salt under the sun. Vermont's hard winter hadn't fully loosened its grip, but the signs were there. A thaw, slow and stubborn, creeping into both the earth and the people who lived upon it. Lark felt it too. But where nature began to bloom, her thoughts grew tangled. She had lived with Bo and Maisy for over 6 weeks. What had begun as a rescue had become a routine. She knew the creak in the floorboard by the fireplace, the way Maisy liked her toast cut into triangles, the sound Bo made when he was focused. Half sigh, half hum. There was a rhythm to this place, and she had settled into it like she'd always belonged. But it wasn't hers, and that haunted her more than she expected. One morning, as she sat rocking Hope in the nursery Bo had built, Lark stared out the window and realized how fast time had passed. Her daughter had outgrown the tiniest onesies. Her cries now came with demands. Her eyes followed movement. She was already a little person becoming someone. Lark thought about what came next. She had once dreamed of becoming a nurse. She remembered tracing diagrams in her textbooks, imagining a life where she could help, where her presence mattered. After being cast out, those dreams had felt like ashes. But now, a letter had arrived. A response to the application she had filled out one sleepless night, after a long feeding, while Bo dozed on the couch with a book still open on his chest. A vocational training program out of state, a grant to cover housing, a child-friendly dorm, evening classes, a future, and a choice, she told Bo 3 days later. They were chopping vegetables in the kitchen, Maisy at the table coloring, Hope asleep in the sling across Lark's chest. "It's in Providence," Lark said, voice low. "It's a 1-year program. It starts in March." Bo paused, knife still in hand. "I didn't know you'd applied," he said carefully. "I wasn't sure I'd send it in," she replied. "But I did, and they accepted me." He set the knife down gently. "That's incredible, Lark." She looked at him, trying to read what lived beneath those words. "But?" He didn't answer right away. He turned to the stove, stirred the soup. "I guess I just thought maybe you were staying," he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Lark knew that kind of calm. It was the kind people used when they were trying not to break. "I thought so too," she whispered, "and maybe I still am. I haven't decided." That night, after Maisy had gone to bed and the fire had dulled to soft coals, Lark sat on the rug, Hope nestled in the crook of her arm. Her notebook lay open beside her, but she didn't write. She just stared into the flames. Bo came downstairs and stood in the doorway. "I'm not angry," he said softly. "I know," Lark replied, "but you're disappointed." "I'm scared," he admitted. "I'm scared that once you leave, we won't see you again." Lark looked up. Her face, usually so composed, crumpled at the edges. "I never asked to find this," she said, voice trembling. "I never expected you, or Maisy, or this home. But I also never expected to want more than just survival, and now I do." Bo knelt beside her. "Wanting more doesn't mean leaving everything behind." Lark stared down at Hope. "She deserves a mom who can give her something stable, who can stand on her own. She already has one. But will she remember that, or just the part where I left?" Bo's hand found her shoulder, light but steady. "Then write it down, help her understand, just like you've always done." Later that night, she took her notebook upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, opened to a fresh page, and began to write. Her hand shook. Her heart pounded. "Dear Hope, today I was offered something I never thought I'd get again. A second chance. It's a chance to rebuild a life with purpose, to make something out of all the pieces I thought were broken. But to take it, I might have to leave the place where I first remembered how to breathe. I'm scared you won't understand. I'm scared I'll hurt the people who taught me how to heal. But I also want you to see a mother who tried, who didn't stay small because she was afraid. Maybe it's selfish, maybe it's brave, maybe it's both. Love, Mom." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the wooden box by the hearth. Then, in a quiet moment of hesitation, she reached in and took it back out. She didn't want Hope to read that letter years from now and wonder why her mother had left without saying goodbye. Because if she stayed, it wouldn't be by default, and if she left, it wouldn't be without love. She tucked the letter into the back of her notebook, where it would remain unread. For now. The next morning, Bo found her in the kitchen, a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I haven't made a decision," she said. "But I want you to read this." He looked down at the letter, then up at her. "I already know," he said. "I know whatever choice you make, it'll come from love." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I just didn't want to disappear," she whispered. "You won't," he said. And he meant it, because no matter what happened next, whether Lark stayed or left, whether Hope learned to walk beneath this roof or another, she had carved herself into the bones of this house, into their hearts. And sometimes that was what family meant. Lark left at the end of February, just as the snow began to recede in earnest. The driveway, once buried under drifts, turned to slush. Icicles broke from the porch roof like falling glass, and the trees, long stripped bare, began to stretch toward a sky that hinted faintly of spring. She didn't leave with fanfare. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no grand declarations, just hugs, long and tearful. A letter tucked into Bo's coat pocket, a kiss on Maisy's forehead, and a whispered promise, "I'll write, I'll visit, I'll be back." And then she was gone. The cabin felt it immediately. The room she and Hope had shared remained tidy, quiet but somehow echoing. The rocking chair no longer creaked. The cradle remained, lined with the quilt Bo had laid there. He didn't pack it away. He couldn't. Maisy asked about Lark often at first. Where is Providence? Do they have snow there? Do babies miss people too? Bo answered each question honestly, gently, always ending with the same words. She misses us, but she's doing something brave. Maisy accepted this mostly. Children, for all their questions, understand the ebb and flow of love more naturally than adults. But Bo, he felt the emptiness in a deeper register, because for the first time since Ellen had died, the house had been more than a structure. It had been alive again, and now it was quieter than it had ever been. Time moved differently in the quiet. March turned to April. The winds softened. Grass peeked through the frost, and Bo returned to fixing clocks. He reopened the little workshop behind the cabin, the one Lark and Hope never saw. It smelled of sawdust and time. People in town had started to bring in pieces again. A cuckoo clock missing its chime, a music box stuck on a single note, a pocket watch left behind by a grandfather long gone. Bo worked with a steadiness that soothed more than the machines. Every click, every tick restored brought a small peace. And yet, not a day passed that he didn't think of Hope's laughter, Lark's quiet strength, the way they had brought color into a life that had grayed too soon. He didn't write to her, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to put it all into words. How do you thank someone for changing your life and then walking away so you could keep living it? Instead, he built things, little things. A wooden rattle he mailed without a note. A mobile made from old watch gears and beads, shaped like stars and clouds. A carved frame for a photo Maisy drew of all four of them standing in the snow. The packages went out in brown paper with no return address, but he knew Lark would understand. Spring bloomed into summer. Maisy finished 4th grade and began writing her own letters, asking if Hope liked books, if she could crawl yet, if Lark had made any new friends. The mailbox became a source of hope again, and sometimes it delivered. Lark's letters came once or twice a month. They were short, sometimes just a postcard, but always warm, always steady. She was doing well. Hope was growing fast. The program was intense, but she felt like she was finally building something she could call hers. Bo read them each night she sent one, sometimes twice. He kept them in the box by the hearth, the one that used to hold Lark's letters to Hope. Now, it held her letters to all of them. The box had become a kind of altar. That September, Maisy left for a weekend with her cousins, and Bo found himself alone in the cabin for the first time in months. The silence was sharper now. Not unfriendly, but thicker, like memory had settled into the corners. He made coffee, sat in the armchair by the fire, and finally opened the letter Lark had tucked into his coat the day she left. He hadn't read it before. Not because he forgot, but because a part of him wasn't ready. Now he was. Bo, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Not in the forever way, just the hard way, the brave way, the way you taught me to walk toward. There are things I wanted to say but couldn't. Maybe I was afraid, maybe I didn't trust myself not to cry too hard, but I want you to know that I never planned on staying because I didn't think I was the kind of person worth keeping. You and Maisy taught me otherwise. You gave me more than shelter. You gave me dignity, warmth, and the space to remember that I am more than my worst moments. I left because I want Hope to grow up seeing her mother stand on her own. But that doesn't mean I left you behind. I carry you with me, every day, in every step forward. If the road leads back to you one day, I hope you'll still be there. Love, Lark. Bo folded the letter carefully, his throat too tight for words. He looked around the cabin, the hearth, the cradle, the box of letters, and felt something shift. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply made room for him to keep living. And now, in the quiet she left behind, something else began to stir. Hope. The first snowfall of the new year arrived unannounced. It came overnight, layering the world in hush and white. Bo woke to find the trees bowed under the weight of fresh snow, their limbs like arms stretching toward the frozen sky. The cabin was still, holding the silence like breath. He moved slower these days. The stiffness in his knees had grown worse over the fall. The occasional shortness of breath had become something else entirely. He had ignored it longer than he should have, until he couldn't. He'd been officially diagnosed in November, congestive heart failure. Manageable, the doctor said. Treatable with care, but irreversible. Still, he didn't tell Maisy. Not yet. She had enough on her shoulders, starting middle school, finding her feet without Lark and Hope in the house. And besides, he felt fine. Most days. He could still mend clocks, still make pancakes on Saturdays, still get lost in old jazz records and daydreams by the fire. But that morning, the cold felt sharper than usual. The walk to the mailbox left him winded. And when he stooped to feed the dog, something inside his chest clutched tight. He never made it to the door. The neighbor found him first, collapsed just beyond the porch, a dusting of snow on his shoulders, one mitten still in hand. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Maisy, at school, was spared the sight. They called Lark, because she was still listed as emergency contact. Bo had never changed it. He didn't want to. He awoke in a sterile hospital room, light bleeding in from the blinds in pale streaks. The machines beeped steadily, a rhythm he didn't yet recognize as his own, and beside him, asleep in a worn gray hoodie, her head resting near his hand, Lark. Her hair was longer now, her face older but not hardened. Her hands, those same hands that once trembled beside the fire, were resting over his. He blinked, slowly, carefully, as if his body had waited for this moment to start healing. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a long time they just looked at each other. No words, just the kind of quiet that says everything. Later, when the nurse stepped out and the silence returned, Lark pulled her chair closer. "I got a call from Maisy's school," she said softly. "She told them who to call. Smart girl." Bo smiled weakly. She always was. "You scared us. I scared myself." There was a pause. Then, "I came as soon as I could." He turned his head. "You're really here?" Lark nodded. "I'm really here." Bo's eyes welled, unbidden. "You didn't have to." "Yes," she said firmly, "I did." She stayed by his side for 3 days. During that time, Hope visited, now a confident, curious 5-year-old, holding Maisy's hand like they'd never spent a day apart. They played in the waiting room, built towers out of tongue depressors, and made the nurses laugh with their knock-knock jokes. Maisy kept asking, "When can we bring Dad home?" Lark's answer never changed. "Soon." And when they weren't all together, Lark read aloud to Bo, sometimes from the news, sometimes old letters from the wooden box she had brought with her. One night, she pulled out a folded piece of paper Bo had never seen. "I wrote this when I thought I might not come back," she said. "But now I think I should read it aloud." He nodded. She unfolded it. "Dear Hope, there are people in this world who hold the line for us when we're too tired to stand. People who see us before we can see ourselves. Your mother was held like that once, by a man who didn't owe her anything, who gave anyway. I didn't know how to repay that. So I left. I built something I'm proud of, yes, but I left part of my heart in that house on the hill. And now, as I sit beside his hospital bed, I realize some debts aren't meant to be repaid, they're meant to be carried forward. This is how we love, sweet girl. We show up, we stay, even when it's hard, especially then. Love, Mom." Bo turned his head, a single tear sliding into his hairline. "Lark," he whispered. "Yes? I missed you every day." She reached for his hand. "I know, I missed you too." He was released a week later. Not to a nurse's facility, not to an empty house, but home. Lark had already moved back in, quietly rearranging the nursery into a guest room, setting up Hope's new cot next to Maisy's bed, filling the pantry with groceries and their silence with warmth. When Bo stepped through the door, bundled in layers, cane in hand, he stopped just inside the threshold. The fire was lit. The box of letters still sat beside the hearth, but now it was joined by a new notebook, a fresh one, a story not yet written. Lark appeared beside him. "Welcome home," she said. He looked at her, not just at her face but at the space between them, now closed. "Are you staying?" he asked, careful. Lark didn't answer with words. Instead, she slid her hand into his. The seasons turned again. Spring settled over Vermont with a gentler hand this time. Early sun warming the eaves, robins returning to the trees, crocuses pushing up through thawed soil like soft declarations of survival. Inside the cabin on the hill, life unfolded in quiet rhythms. Bo rose later now, moving slowly but deliberately. His body still protested, but his spirit had found something close to rest. He had begun sketching again. Small mechanical toys, simple wooden keepsakes. Not to sell, not to fix, just to build, just to be part of the world with his hands. Maisy was growing into herself, curious, creative, and watchful. She loved fiercely and asked questions no adult could answer quickly. She'd started calling Hope her little sister cousin, a title that stuck like glue and made everyone in the house smile. And Lark had changed in ways no one could measure. She had finished her training. She'd come back not as the girl from the snowbank, but as a woman who had walked through fire and brought something living back with her. She now worked part-time at a clinic in town, her stethoscope hanging from the same hands that once trembled beside a hearth. She still wrote letters, some for Hope, some for herself, and once, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, one for Bo. He hadn't read it yet. He wasn't ready. Not because he didn't want to know what it said, but because he already did. On the first truly warm day of the year, the four of them had a picnic in the meadow behind the house. It wasn't fancy, just sandwiches, lemonade, and wild laughter echoing off the trees. Hope ran in lopsided circles, her curls bouncing, while Maisy braided dandelions into a crown. Bo sat on a blanket beneath the old maple tree, his cane resting beside him. Lark brought over a folded quilt and knelt beside him, her eyes shining in the sun. "I never asked," she said. "Why clocks?" Bo looked down at the old pocket watch in his palm, its casing dull with age but ticking true. "They're patient," he said. "They wait for you to understand them, and once you do, they forgive you for all the time you've lost." Lark smiled. "That sounds like something you wrote in a letter." He chuckled. "Maybe I should have." She rested her head on his shoulder. "You did more than write." That evening, as twilight softened the edges of the house, Bo sat by the hearth, a cup of tea in hand, the wooden box of letters open beside him. Maisy was upstairs reading to Hope, whose giggles occasionally floated down like music. Lark emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She paused in the doorway, watching him. "You ever think about how strange it is?" she asked. "What?" "That we all ended up here, by accident almost, like threads that didn't match but still wove together." Bo nodded. "Some patterns only make sense when you step back far enough." She moved to sit beside him on the rug. "I still write to her." "I know. But lately, I think I've been writing for me, too." Bo reached into the box and pulled out a letter, one marked with Hope's name in a different, newer hand. "I think that's how it's supposed to be," he said. "So that when she's ready, she won't just know what happened. She'll know who you were becoming." Lark blinked back tears. "Do you think that's enough?" "No," Bo said softly. "I think it's everything." That night, he watched them, Lark, Maisy, and Hope, sleeping, each in their corner of the house. He walked the hall slowly, stopping by each door like a man counting stars, not out of fear, but reverence. In the nursery, Hope stirred in her sleep. Bo leaned over the crib and gently tucked the quilt back around her. She blinked open, groggy eyes and whispered, "Papa?" He froze. She'd never called him that before. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'm here, sweetheart." Her eyes fluttered closed again, and something inside him, something that had long been bruised and waiting, healed. The next morning, a new letter sat on the hearth. Not in Lark's hand, Maisy's. It read, "Dear Hope, I think we're really lucky. Some people never find home and we get to grow up in one. Not because it's perfect, but because people here stay even when they're scared, even when they're tired, even when they didn't mean to love each other but did anyway. I hope when we're older we still live nearby. I hope we still build snow forts and eat pancakes and write silly letters. Love, your sister-cousin." Maisy Bo smiled as he placed it gently in the box. He added more firewood to the hearth. The flames flickered, soft and golden. They had burned low once, but never out. And now, as a new day bloomed behind the windows, the hearth still glowed. Because some stories don't end in grand declarations. They end in warmth, in light, in the kind of quiet that feels like home. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Truly. Stories like these remind us that even in the coldest seasons of life, a little kindness can spark a miracle. I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if this story touched you in any way, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it helps us keep sharing stories that uplift, inspire, and heal. From my heart to yours, thank you for watching. And until next time, may your hearth always stay warm.